Summary of Chasing Lincoln's Killer by James L. Swanson. Chasing Lincoln's Killer starts in 1865, when the Civil War has been going on for 4 years. The Confederacy wanted to break away from the Union, so President Abraham Lincoln led the Union forces against the Confederacy. After General Robert E. Lee gave up at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, it seemed like the war would end soon. Lincoln finally felt like he had less to do as president, so on April 14, which was Good Friday, he took his wife Mary Todd Lincoln to the theater. Since their son died in 1862, Mary Todd had been sad, and Lincoln wanted to spend real time with her. At the same time, John Wilkes Booth, one of the most famous actors in the country, was crushed by the news that the Confederacy was about to lose. In late 1864, Booth had a plan to kidnap President Lincoln and then use him as a hostage to change how the war turned out. He went to Canada to meet with people who liked the Confederacy and make links. He then got in touch with David Harold, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, the Surratt family, and Dr. Samuel Mudd, who would all be involved in the murder. But the plan to kidnap didn't work out because the president changed his mind at the last minute. Booth saw Lincoln give his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, and a speech about voting rights for freed blacks on April 11, 1865. In each case, he had the chance to shoot the president, but he didn't. On April 14, 1865, Booth saw an opportunity. When he went to the Ford Theater to get his mail, he heard that President and Mrs. Lincoln were going to see the evening show. He quickly got in touch with his partners in crime from the 1864 plan. Booth wanted to hit several people in the executive branch at the same time. Lewis Powell and David Harold would try to kill Secretary of State Seward. George Atzerodt would kill Vice President Johnson, and Booth would kill President Lincoln in his box at the theater. Atzerodt said he didn't want to do it, but Booth threatened him, so he went through with it. Booth also talked to Mary Surratt, who rode from her rooming house in Washington to an inn she owned in Maryland to get goods ready for Booth to pick up after he killed the president later that night. Booth's plans for that night at the theater came to fruition. He knew how the theater was set up and how the play went, so he was able to get to the president's box without any trouble. He timed the shot of his gun so that it happened when the audience was laughing so hard at a joke the lead actor told. He shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head with a Derringer gun that only had one shot. The large bullet went into Lincoln's brain and killed him. The first person to respond was the president's guest that night at the theater, Major Henry Rathbone. He tried to attack Booth, but the attacker got away while he was getting cut badly. Booth jumped off the side of the president's box and onto the stage. Rathbone was trying to grab Booth, so he fell awkwardly on the stage and broke his leg a few inches above the ankle. He didn't care about the pain, so he yelled Sic Semper Tyrannis, which is the state motto of Virginia in Latin and means thus always to tyrants. He also yelled, "The South is avenged," and then he ran out the back of Ford's Theater with his knife in his hand, threatening everyone in his way. Only one person tried to catch him, but Booth had a horse waiting for him in the back alley, so he was able to get away. He quickly rode to a bridge that led across the river to Maryland and talked the guard into letting him cross, even though there was a curfew at 9 p.m. In the theater, there was a lot of confusion, but a young doctor called Charles Leal ran to the president's booth. When he saw that Major Rathbone had been stabbed, he first thought that the president had also been stabbed. When he looked for stab cuts on Lincoln's body and didn't find any, he opened the president's eyes and saw that his pupils were dilated, which meant he had a brain injury. Even though he knew right away that Lincoln would not live, he was able to stabilize his situation. Strangely, he let an actor named Laura Keene hold the president's head in her lap while he was hurt. Leal then watched as people carried Lincoln out of the theater. It wouldn't be right for Lincoln to die in a place where people go to have fun, especially on a Christian holy day like Good Friday. They got a room at a hostel across the street. While this was going on, Lewis Powell and David Harold were at the Seward home coming up with a way to get into the house of the Secretary of State. Seward had been hurt badly in a carriage accident the week before. He was bedridden and easy to attack because of this. Powell had a small package with him. He told the doorman, William Bell, that it was medicine that Seward's doctor had asked Powell to give to the secretary himself. Powell asked to see the secretary, but Bell wouldn't let him. Eventually, Powell found out where the sick man was lying. Powell fought violently with Seward's two boys, Frederick and Augustus, as well as the army nurse who was sitting by Seward's bedside and even his daughter, Fanny. He used the knife to cut the secretary's face, but it didn't kill him. Powell could have killed Sergeant Robinson, an army nurse, but he had a change of heart and just hit him, said he was crazy, and ran away. David Harold was scared by the screams coming from the Seward house, so he ran away. He followed the same path that Booth took to get away, and he met up with his boss in Maryland. Powell didn't know the city very well, so he hid in a tree for 2 nights until he decided what to do next. Atzerodt did not try to kill the vice president, as he had said he would. He was stupid because he didn't realize that the things found in Booth's room would link him to the plot anyway. The word got out about the 2 strikes from Ford's Theater and the Seward Mansion. There was chaos on the streets because groups of people were telling each other different stories. Edwin Stanton, who was Secretary of War, was told by a messenger that Seward had been attacked. He didn't find out that Lincoln had also been attacked until he went to Seward's house to see if the story was true. He thought right away that the Confederate government was behind the killings and feared for the safety of other cabinet members. Seward went to the Peterson house and took charge of the situation. He made sure the president was safe and started an investigation into the 2 attacks. At Ford's, he heard from several people that Lincoln had been attacked by the famous and beautiful actor John Wilkes Booth. While this was going on, Booth was glad to meet Harold, who was a much better outdoorsman than he was. The 2 men went to the inn in Surrattsville to get the guns that Mary Surratt had set up and then went to Dr. Samuel Mudd's house. Mudd was part of the first plot to take Lincoln, but Booth and Harold did not tell him that they had just done something much worse. Booth was hurt, so Mudd took care of him, and the 2 men chose to stay at Mudd's house until the next night. The next day, Harold and Mudd went to Bryantown, a nearby town, where Harold hoped to get a buggy to keep going south. Harold, on the other hand, saw the 13th New York Cavalry in Bryantown, where they were setting up the searches center. He told Mudd he didn't want the buggy anymore and ran back to Mudd's farm to tell Booth. Mudd found out that Booth had killed the president while he was going about his business in Bryantown, but he did not turn Booth in. Instead, he went back to his farm and helped Booth get ready to keep running away. He told them that Captain Cox would help them, so he sent them to him. Captain Cox told Booth and Harold to hide in a pine thicket and got a Confederate spy named Thomas Jones to help them. Jones told the men to wait in the thicket until the people looking for them gave up looking in that area and went further south. He brought them food and news for 4 days. Booth was upset and angry about how the newspapers Jones brought him talked about his crime. He gave a friend a letter in which he described why he was doing what he was doing. He asked the friend to give the letter to the newspapers. This answer didn't show up anywhere. Booth's friend was too scared to deliver the letter, so he burned it instead. Back in Washington, the attack on Secretary Seward was thought to have been done by John Surratt, Mary Surratt's son. On April 17, they were at the house asking the people who lived there questions when Lewis Powell knocked on Surratt's boarding house door. He was looking for a safe place to stay. Powell and Mary Surratt were both put in jail. Michael Oliphant and Samuel Arnold were also caught that day. They were involved in the plan to kidnap Booth and were named in a letter found in Booth's hotel room. On April 20, George Atzerodt was found at the house of his cousin. He told a story that put Dr. Samuel Mudd and Mary Surratt in the middle of the plan. Stanton had to pay attention to the last fights of the war and couldn't give the manhunt his full attention. Colonel Lafayette Baker, a friend he could trust, came down from New York to help him lead the probe. Baker was an egotistical person who tried to take all the credit for Booth's capture. This made many of the other detectives angry. After Stanton announced on April 20 that there would be a $100,000 prize for Booth, Harold, and John Surratt's capture, Colonel Baker also wanted to get all the credit for the capture so he could cash in on the reward money. Thomas Jones saw the troops leave town on April 20th, so he told Booth and Harold to try to cross the Potomac River into Virginia tonight. Virginia, not like Maryland, was part of the Confederacy. Even though manhunters would be looking for them there, too, the farther they could get into the South, the safer they would be. Jones gave Booth and Harold a boat and told them what direction to row. They tried to pay him for all he had done for them, but he wouldn't take money in exchange for his help. Finally, he took the money for the boat. Booth and Harold rowed through the dark night on the river, but they soon realized they were going in the wrong direction. They were still in Maryland. Lucky for them, Harold knew where they had landed. The two guys went to stay with friends who lived nearby. Then, they lost a whole day before crossing the river into Virginia on April 22nd at night. They got help from a woman named Elizabeth Quessenberry on the other side of the river. She gave them horses. Dr. Mudd had told them to stop at the farm of a guy named Dr. Richard Stewart, so they did. Booth had high hopes for Southern kindness, but Dr. Stewart let them eat but wouldn't let them stay the night. Booth scared one of Stewart's neighbors into letting them stay the night by threatening to hurt them. The man's son drove them to Port Conway the next day. There, they met 3 Confederate soldiers who promised to help them, and a fisherman named William Rawlins gave them a ride across the Rappahannock River into Virginia. Willie Jett, a Confederate soldier, took Booth and Harold to the Garrett's home, where they had a nice meal and slept for the night. The next day, though, they seemed scared when horse officers rode by, which made the Garretts suspicious. That night, the Garretts wouldn't let them sleep in the house, so they let them sleep in the tobacco barn instead. Booth and Harold didn't know it, but the Garretts put them in the tobacco barn because they were afraid they would steal their horses. Colonel Baker got a tip about where the fugitives might be, so he sent Luther Byron Baker, Colonel Everton Conger, and Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty to look into it. The detectives talked to William Rawlins, who told them where they might find Willie Jett. Willie Jett, in turn, told the investigators where they could find John Wilkes Booth. Booth and Harold could hear the troops coming, but they were locked in the barn and couldn't get out. Harold turned himself in, but Booth wouldn't leave. The people who were looking for Booth wanted to catch him alive so that he could be tried and put to death. They decided to burn down the tobacco barn to make him leave. Booth got ready to shoot as many of the manhunters as he could while he was in flames. Sergeant Boston Corbett, on the other hand, shot him. Corbett said that he had done what he did to protect his friends. Harold was taken to Washington to stand trial while Booth died on the farm. Mary Surratt, David Harold, Lewis Powell, and George Atzerodt were given death sentences and put to death on July 6, 1865. Other conspirators were sent to prison. Today, people come to Ford's Theater to remember what John Wilkes Booth did, but also to remember what Abraham Lincoln stood for and died for.
About the author. James L. Swanson came from a family of people who liked to tell stories. His grandfather worked for the Chicago police and told his family stories about thieves during Prohibition and anti-Vietnam War protesters. For his 10th birthday, his grandma, who worked for Chicago tabloid newspapers, gave him an engraving of the Derringer pistol that Booth used to kill Lincoln. This started a lifelong interest in the 16th president and his death. He got his law degree from UCLA and worked as a special assistant in the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel. Swanson has also written books about the search for Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, and the killing of President John F. Kennedy.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.